University of Moncton will award an honorary Doctor of Art degree to Virginia Pesamapeo Bordelot. Born in James Bay, Miss Pesamapeo Bordelot is an EU multidisciplinary artist and has been for more than 40 years. She has exhibited her surrealist paintings in vibrant colours in Quebec, Canada, in Europe and in Mexico. The author of 3 novels, 3 collections of poetry, a children's book, correspondence and short stories. She's no stranger to honours. I don't have enough time to list all the awards she has won, but in 2020, she was awarded, for example, the prize for the Artist of the Year in Abitibi-Témiscamingue by the Conseil des Arts et Lettres du Québec. In 2021, she was awarded the Medal of the Quebec National Assembly for her body of work, and in 2023, she was made a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques de la République Française. She continues to paint, sculpt, and, of course, write in Seine-Terre. Congratulations, Miss Pesamapeo Bordelot, on this new and well-deserved honour. The Honourable Member for Nickel Belt.
Mr. Speaker, at a recent Federation of Northern Ontario Municipalities conference, community leaders came together to unite on how to continue unlocking the North's potential. This includes supporting and expanding the North's prosperous mining sector, which is a major leader of the green energy transition. Last week, the federal government announced $11 million for EV battery-operated vehicles at the Onaping Depth underground mine in Nickel Belt.
Whether it's mining, pulp and paper, forestry, or other economic development sectors, Northern Ontario continues to offer solutions. At the BV In-Depth Mines to Mobility Conference at Cambrian College, industry experts will explore the challenges of establishing a complete battery supply chain for electric vehicles. The member for Sudbury and I will both be in attendance. We invite everyone to be there as well. Thank you.
The honourable member from Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, crime, chaos and disorder are getting much worse in Saskatoon. In neighbourhood after neighbourhood, the government-fueled opioid crime spree is hurting everyday, common-sense Canadians. The Liberal-funded supervised drug consumption site on 20th Street has created a chaotic and dangerous situation for residents. The local dentist, who cleans up garbage and human feces on a daily basis, was assaulted and delays appointments because her clients can't get into the building. Last week, Canada Post stopped deliveries to this area because of the rampant drug use and crime. In the Fairhaven area, a new 106-bed shelter has attracted chaos and disorder to a formerly calm neighbourhood. The Mayor has acknowledged that tent encampments have tripled in the past year, pushing locals out of their park and making residents fearful to go outside even during the day. This is Saskatoon after 9 years of the NDP Liberal so-called harm reduction. Mr. Speaker, the only way out is for a new Conservative government that will finally end the drugs and stop the crime.
Hear, hear. Before I recognize the member from Thunder Bay Rainy River, I'll just ask members to take their seats. The honourable member from Thunder Bay Rainy River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Saturday night, Ukrainian boxer Alexander Usyk defeated a much bigger fighter, Tyson Fury, to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, the first in 24 years. Ironically, Fury himself first became a champion in beating another Ukrainian fighter, Vladimir Klitschko, the brother of the current mayor of Ukraine. As Russia continues to defend itself against a much larger Russian invader, it has been struggling to hold the front line in recent weeks, largely due to a shortage of ammunition that is thankfully starting to arrive from the United States. Saturday was a great victory for Usyk, a great victory for boxing, and most of all, a great victory for Ukraine, as Usyk showed the world how with sufficient heart, strength, and intelligence, a smaller fighter can always defeat a larger one. Slava Ukraini!
Député de Sudbury.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to materials, anything that isn't grown is mined. Canada's rich critical minerals resources are a generational economic opportunity. These minerals are the building blocks of clean technologies, from lithium and EV batteries to copper transmission lines, and so much more that the world needs to build a prosperous and sustainable future. Our $100 billion mining industry supports 700,000 direct and indirect jobs, including in my riding of Sudbury. This is an industry with many well-paying union jobs, of which we are proud of. We are unlocking our critical minerals future through our $3.8 billion strategy, including an infrastructure fund, R&D program, tax credit, and Indigenous partnership programs. Mr. Speaker, we owe it to our mining businesses, to our innovators, and most of all, to the upcoming generations of workers, to make sure the Canadian economy will thrive in a changing world. And that is exactly what we are doing.
Hear, hear. The honourable member from Fundy Royal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Prime Minister's soft on crime agenda has led to a crime wave of motor vehicle theft, and Canadians are paying the cost. The cost of insurance claims for auto theft has skyrocketed to $1.5 billion, smashing the previous record. Not only are Canadians having their vehicles stolen, but they're also facing higher insurance premiums thanks to this Liberal government's refusal to crack down on auto theft. In Ontario alone, the Insurance Bureau of Canada estimated that auto theft has added an extra $130 to insurance payments last year, and that number is set to go up again. Conservatives will hit the brakes on auto theft. We will end the Liberals' catch-and-release justice system that gives bail to repeat offenders within hours of their arrest. We will repeal Bill C-5 to take away house arrest for auto theft so that criminals can no longer walk out their front door to steal another car. Our common sense plan will protect your property and bring home safe streets.
The honourable member from Brampton North.
Great pleasure to rise today to recognize an organization in my community that takes environmental conservation to heart. The Heart Lake Turtle Troopers were recently named Brampton's 2024 Broad Green Environmental Award winners. Mr. Speaker, not only do they actually save injured turtles and build and maintain nest protectors to keep them safe, they also collect data and run education campaigns to secure the future of conservation for these turtles. This is a grassroots organization that started out with only 2 members and now has a community of volunteers. Protecting our planet is all of our responsibility, and this organization is proof that small actions can have a big impact. Congratulations to the Heart Lake Turtle Troopers, and thank you for all the work that you do for conservation in our community.
Hear, hear. The honourable member from Humber River, Black Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the House today in support of Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly. Taiwan's exclusion from global health initiatives is a significant gap in global health security that must be addressed. Despite Taiwan's significant contributions to global health worldwide, through providing aid and assistance to many countries, it has faced obstacles in fully participating in WHO initiatives. Taiwan's inclusion into the World Health Assembly would not only benefit its citizens, but also the global community. Considering the upcoming WHO meeting from May 27th to June 1st, I urge the World Health Organization and its members to recognize Taiwan's efforts and contribution to global health and to grant it full participation in the World Health Assembly. Let Taiwan help. It has lots to offer. Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. The honourable member from Foothills.
After 9 years, this Liberal NDP government is not worth the cost to Canadian farmers, this time cutting funding to one of our most successful volunteer organizations. For 111 years, 4-H Canada has been teaching Canadian youth about community, farming, and leadership. But in one of his first moves, the Liberal Agriculture Minister celebrated this incredible milestone by slashing funding to 4-H by 30%, forcing them to restructure and putting incredible programs like the Citizenship Congress at risk. 4-H'ers learn by doing, working hard to promote sustainable agriculture and teaching Canadians about where their food comes from. Conservatives understand the importance of Canadian agriculture and being a champion for Canadian youth who are going to be driving innovation and future economic growth. That's why a future Conservative government will reverse the Liberal funding cuts to 4-H by diverting millions of dollars from Agriculture Canada, because our priority is not going to be useless consultants. Our priority is Canadian youth programs like 4-H.
The honourable member from from Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
After 9 years of this Liberal NDP Prime Minister, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. The Parliamentary Budget Officer agrees. According to his report, the government is failing to meet their target of ending homelessness. In fact, it's getting worse, increasing 88% between 2018 and 2022, with nearly 80% purely based on affordability reasons. Since then, Mr. Speaker, with the help of their NDP enablers and grocery store lobbyist connections, food inflation is at a 40-year high. This is a direct result of a government that has refused to take responsibility for its actions. The response is always the same on their failures. It's not our fault, but don't worry, we will fix it later. The alarming stats on homelessness are outright insulting. These are not just numbers, Mr. Speaker, these are people. After nearly a decade in power, Canada is not recognizable, looking more like it did in 1934, not like it should in 2024, nor like it will under a common-sense Conservative government.
Before we move to the next speaker, I might ask the Assistant Sergeant at Arms just to ask people in the lobbies to please keep their voices down. It carries over into the House.
The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What could be more unifying than a public market? It's a place where the community comes together. It's a showcase for our local producers and artisans. And under Sylvie Brunel, Sherbrooke's Marché de la Guerre has also become a place where magic simply happens. As coordinator of the Corporation du Marché de la Guerre, Ms. Brunel has, over the past few years, created a cohesive group of local players to offer Sherbrooke residents some incredible and amazing events. A visit to the Christmas market, for example, has become a tradition for many Sherbrooke families. Ms. Brunel never hesitates to lend a hand to liven up her events. She even plays Mrs. Claus herself, much to the delight of the young ones. She's also very involved with young entrepreneurs, welcoming them during the summer to give them their first sales experience. Having achieved her objectives, Madame Brunel has decided to devote herself to new projects. I wish her every success in the future and thank her on behalf of all Sherbrooke residents for her involvement in our community.
The Honourable Member from Churchill-Kiwatinuk-Askey.
This past week, 3 more countries announced that they will be formally recognizing Palestine as a state. Around the world, the overwhelming reaction has been, it's about time. This means that 143 countries will recognize Palestine as a state. They recognize that Palestinian statehood is something that's granted. It's an inherent right. We're also seeing how empty the words are of those that support a two-state solution but argue there should not be a recognition of Palestinian statehood unless it's negotiated. Which brings us to this Liberal government. At a critical time in history, they stand for everything and nothing. Where do they actually stand on Palestinian statehood? If there's one lesson from history, it's that it didn't just happen. The conflict in Palestine didn't just happen. A two-state solution is needed to build peace. It requires 2 states and the political will to make this happen. Our message in this parliament should be clear. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Recognizing Palestine as a state is being part of the solution. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs must take a stand for peace, for security, for justice.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean.
All right, Pierre's in the House.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to solidarity and mutual aid, we know what we're talking about in Lac-Saint-Jean. Over 5 years ago, the municipality of Saint-François-de-Sales, in my riding, became a veritable food desert when the only grocery store in the area closed. It was almost impossible for many elderly people to get to larger municipalities. The community rolled up its sleeves in search of a solution. That's how the Saint-François Dépanneur came into being. Open year-round, 7 hours a day, 4 days a week, the Dépanneur is supported entirely by the work of volunteers. In fact, it was these same volunteers who designed it and who are now in charge of all operations. It's no surprise that the Saint-François Dépanneur is a source of pride for the municipality, and above all, it's a model that proves that in Lac-Saint-Jean, we've got a heart and soul, and that we never hesitate when it's time to pull together. To all the volunteers whose involvement makes a real difference in our community, from the very bottom of our hearts, thank you.
The Honourable Member from Carleton.
Today I rise in equal parts sadness and gratitude to honor the incredible life of a great Canadian, Rex Murphy. Rex was born a proud Newfoundlander. He became known as a pugnacious critic of those in power, even Joey Smallwood, and that wasn't easy in those days. He would go on to be a political assistant for both major political parties in that province, and then a national voice. He would give fantastic, spectacular rants on the CBC. Yes, even I watch CBC to listen to Rex. And he would then go on to host Cross Country Checkup, where he would listen with compassion and respect to the voices of the common people. He would write many, many pieces of good works in poetry, in storytelling, in polemics. And that voice will now be missed by all. And so I join with all Canadians in saying, thank you, Rex, for all you have done. May you rest in the peace of God.
I've never, I think there's been a couple times, but usually Pierre doesn't make statements before question period. That's really interesting to see.
The honourable member from Cambridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize the work of the Military Veterans Wellness Program, championed by Toronto Police Constable Aaron Dale. This program provides increased training and awareness for law enforcement assisting veterans in crisis. In my riding, Constables David Cassidy and Brian Serapiglia have been instrumental in bringing the program to Waterloo Region. Thanks to their initiative, we can provide our
Probably
first
got like another couple
responders
minutes of
with
statements.
a better understanding of military culture and de-escalation training, and rapidly refer veterans to national support services. This partnership with Veterans Affairs Canada has expanded to 80 police forces, helping over 200 veterans to date. I encourage my colleagues, all of you in this House, here to reach out to your local law enforcement to ensure that they have access to this incredible free program. Together, Mr. Speaker, we all can equip Canadian law enforcement with the tools that they need to support veterans across Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right, question period.
Oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost, with a 38% increase in homelessness and 1/4 of Canadians skipping meals because of a lack of money. The Bloc voted for $500 billion in centralizing and inflationary spending to add to the another 100,000 public servants and doubling consulting spending. They said they had no choice because the government was going to shut down otherwise. Can the government inform the Bloc that this spending would have been adopted with the NDP regardless of how the Bloc voted?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I find this question somewhat hypocritical because the Conservative Party is talking about homelessness, but in their program and plans, this word doesn't even exist. I find it hypocritical of a party that voted in this House against all the measures that could have given homes to Canadians. And I think that, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party needs to look at what the real intentions of the Conservative Party are with respect to the fight against homelessness. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister doubled the national debt, hiked taxes and inflation, saying that all this money would fund programs, generous programs, to eliminate homelessness. Since then, homelessness has risen by 38%, and 25% of Canadians skip meals because they don't have enough money. It's not because, with the support of the Bloc, the government it's spending all the money of Canadians. Why is the Bloc Liberal coalition forcing Canadians to feed this obese government rather than allowing them to feed Canadian families? The Honourable Minister of Economic Development. Mr. Speaker, it's so hypocritical. This party voted against the school food program. So when we're talking about feeding Canadians, let's start with children, and they're voting against it. When they say, yes, people are asking for money, we're giving them help. There's the child benefit, they're voting against it. And when we say we're going to help Canadians to have roofs over their head and pay their rent, they vote against it. Mr. Speaker, make up your mind. Do you want to help Canadians or cut their services?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
After 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the homelessness and hunger. He doubled the debt, increased taxes, and caused inflation, but said it was all to fund generous programs that would end homelessness. Well, homelessness is now up 38%, and a quarter of Canadians are skipping meals because they can't afford them. That's because his greedy government is consuming everything Canadians earn. Why is the NDP and Liberals forcing Canadians to feed this morbidly obese government instead of feeding their families?
Yes, sir. Here.
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons from the Conservatives who purport to care about poverty
always
and
has
Canadians
the jewelry, the newest watches. She's got all the rings on.
$10 day childcare, early learning and childhood education. They're not supporting our budgetary measures to put food in school lunch boxes for 400,000 children, Mr. Speaker. It's unbelievable that they will at one hand say they support Canadians and on the other hand vote against those supports every single time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I'm grateful that the member points out that we have voted against every single policy that has caused homelessness to rise by 38%. Right. We have voted against every single inflationary policy that has forced 1/4 of Canadians to skip meals because they can't afford a meal on their table. Mr. Speaker, the government has doubled the debt, increased inflation, and blocked home building. Why is it that they force Canadians to feed this morbidly obese government rather than feeding their families?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, our government is actually focused on keeping inflation low so that interest rates can come down. And I will note that inflation has come down below the targeted range of 3%. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, we have Budget 2024. We have supports for renters. We have supports for affordable housing. We have a national school food program on the table, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to support Canadians with dental, with early childhood education, all the while the Conservatives vote against. Mr. Speaker, there's no plan on that side of the House. We will support.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
She repeats the same costly promises the Prime Minister has been breaking for 9 years. Mr. Speaker, in a 6-week period, 50 homeless encampments have opened in Toronto. Let that sink in. There are a total of 256 tent cities in Toronto alone.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
It wasn't like this before this Prime Minister, and it won't be like this after he's gone. Will he admit that everything is broken after 9 years of his government?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, when that member was a minister and had responsibility for housing, that there were more than 2 million more Canadians living in poverty. And the number of times that he talked about vulnerable people or taking action to help homeless, 0. He wants to hold out to people in a time of difficulty across the world that the solution is to cut the programs they need, to take away dental care, to take away pharmacare, and shame on him for it. We will stand up for vulnerable people in a way he never has.
But when he was housing minister, the average price of rent in Canada was like $950.
The honourable member for La Prairie. The Hogue Commission has complained that the Liberals are still being secretive with respect to foreign interference. The PMO is invoking cabinet confidence to redact documents and even to prevent the judge from having access to them. We're not even talking about documents that will be published. We're talking about the documents needed for the judge's investigation, who then has a mandate to protect strategic information. This calls into question the entire effectiveness of this commission. The Minister of Public Security has promised that the judge will have access to all the documents. Does he agree that all of this hiding is enough? Enough is enough? The Honourable Minister of Public Security. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate greatly the question from my Bloc colleague, and I also appreciate working with him and my other colleagues last summer when we established the Hogue Commission. He knows full well that we are committed to sharing with the Commission in an exceptional time, which is not often. We accepted to share information from the Cabinet like we did under Mr. Johnson. We're always available to work with the Commission to ensure that they have access to all the appropriate documents. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. They just can't help it. Let me remind you, the reason we created the Hogue Commission was precisely because the Liberals have been covering up foreign interference since day one. The creation was committed to put an end to all that. And let's get to the bottom of this through a neutral, non-partisan judge. The public doesn't need to read all the confidential information, but the judge does. That's precisely her mandate. If the Commission doesn't have access to all the information, Quebecers will lose confidence in this inquiry. Will the Liberals finally be responsible and above all transparent with the judge?
True. That's one thing I agree with the Bloc on.
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, the answer is yes.
To the public inquiry.
We will continue to remain transparent and cooperative with the Commission.
You don't know anything about transparency.
I agree with my colleague.
If it was right in front of you and slapped you in the face, you still wouldn't even see it.
This is an exceptional justice, like the Justice Hogue, and is in a good position to give Canadians the trust they need in our institutions. And Canadians have to understand that at all times the government will ensure that the Commission does have access to all the necessary documents to do this important work. And I greatly appreciate the work I was able to do with my friend from La Prairie. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-le-Petit-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, its waters are warming too fast, becoming increasingly acidic and containing less and less oxygen. This is the worrisome state of the St. Lawrence River. Scientists are sounding the alarm. We've reached fatal oxygen level for several aquatic species. The time has come to give the river a legal personality. But the Minister of the Environment is ignoring this serious problem. What will it take for this Minister of the Environment to give the St. Lawrence River rights to protect Quebec's biodiversity? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I'd like to remind him that when we came to power in 2015, Canada wasn't even protecting 1% of our territorial waters, and now we're up to 15% and 20% next year, at least 30% by 2030. So this is our objective that all countries agreed on at COP15 in Montreal. And we have established record amounts with partnerships across the country to protect our territory. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, families saw their homes burned to the ground in northern British Columbia this week, and summer hasn't even started. Yet the Conservatives don't seem to think that climate change is real. Yep. And this Environment Minister offers up nothing but empty words and delays. Yeah. The Liberals refuse to invest the $1 billion needed for a BC watershed security fund that would prevent wildfires and save lives. They knew this wildfire season was going to be devastating for communities, yet they're leaving British Columbians to fend for themselves. Will the government fix their mistake and immediately establish a BC watershed security fund?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Speaker, and certainly the issues that we've seen around forest fires last year and unfortunately this year, particularly in British Columbia and in the Fort Nelson area, have been devastating, and certainly our hearts go out to all those folks that were affected. It is the reason why we have set aside $350 million to help provinces procure equipment. It is the reason why we are actually training forest fires, and fundamentally it is the reason why we have a comprehensive climate plan to ensure that we are addressing the existential threat of climate change. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party of Canada has a climate plan. It is to let the planet burn. It is irresponsible. It is shameful.
Buddy, your carbon tax isn't stopping any forest fires anytime soon.
A hat trick for the Prime Minister, but not the good type. 3 reports released in just one day paint a devastating picture of life in Canada after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government. Food Banks Canada, the Salvation Army, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer all say there is more homelessness and there is more hunger. They kept telling us that they're spending our money for our own good, and everything is fine, and it's not their fault. Mr. Speaker, it's been 9 years. That's right. Whose fault is it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, grocery price inflation is coming down. 1.4% in April, down from 1.9% a month before. This is encouraging news, certainly for Canadians, but it's important to know that our government put forward the most comprehensive package of competition reforms in Canadian history. Why? Because more competition equals better prices. But it's a bit rich for the Conservatives to point to food bank lineups when they oppose a national school food program that's going to feed over 400,000 kids across Canada.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
And 9 years later, it hasn't fed a single child. They just don't get it. The very policies that they have delivered has given us the worst quality of life in half a century, the worst since the last Trudeau ran this place. In the past 3 months, 25% of young adults have had to go to a food bank in this country, 38% more homelessness after they promised to end it, and about 50% of Canadians are worse off this year than they were last year. How does this government have so much money to spare while ordinary Canadians are literally going hungry and homeless?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Quite the statement from the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party. My advice to her is to actually read the report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. In that report, she will see that no less than 50,000 Canadians are supported by the National Housing Strategy, specifically the Reaching Home program that they would cut. We know they champion an austerity agenda. This also from the Deputy Leader, who made clear only a few weeks ago on a yacht, no less, Mr. Speaker, that less homes have to be built in Canada. They're siding with the NIMBYs. We want to build more homes, including for the most vulnerable in this country, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadians are hungry and homeless. It's becoming more clear. The more inflationary spending they do, the worse it gets for Canadians. And look no further than the Ottawa Food Bank report that came out this week that said 500,000 visits were made to the food bank in our nation's capital last year. That's a 95% increase in the last 5 years, a 22% increase in the last year alone, and 36% of them were children. How many more times are they going to hike the carbon tax before they realize it's driving millions of more people to food banks?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I find it more than ironic that the Conservative member across the way mentions children when he's going to stand up in short order and oppose a national school food program. A national school food program that Food Banks of Canada and Food Secure Canada have advocated for over 10 years because they know that it will impact food insecurity in this country in a dramatic way. $1 billion in the federal budget 2024 to feed 400,000 more kids, and the Conservatives say, no, we won't support that.
Shameful.
The Honourable Member from Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
And after 9 years, Mr. Speaker, that program has fed exactly 0 children in this country. The only thing it's doing is feeding the bureaucracy here in Ottawa. Well, let's take a look and see what Food Banks Canada had to say about their poverty measures. Their report card came out this week, and this government got an F, a failing grade for what they're doing as they're driving millions of more people to food banks each and every year. Their report says it's only going to get worse the more they hike the carbon tax and make life more expensive. How many more damning reports need to come out before they axe the carbon tax to help with the price of food?
The Honourable Minister for Families and Children.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to share today some of the response from Budget 2024 and the announcement of the funding of the National School Food Program. Breakfast Club Clubs of Canada, Mr. Speaker, released a statement saying that this program marks a turning point in the country's commitment to the well-being of children. Children learn best on a full stomach, Mr. Speaker, and investments today in children are investments for tomorrow. On this side of the House, we will continue to invest in the well-being of children, and I think the Conservatives owe Canadians an explanation why they won't make these investments.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. After 9 years of this Liberal Prime Minister, Quebecers are hungry and increasingly taking to the streets. This week, there were 3 devastating reports confirming that the inflationary spending of the Liberals, supported by the Bloc, is hurting families and workers. And according to the Salvation Army, 25% of parents skip meals to be able to feed their children. How come the Bloc and this Prime Minister, who aren't worth their salt, preferred to feed this fat federal government rather than Quebecers? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, once again, I would ask my colleague to tell his colleagues from the Conservative Party to include in their plans, if they're serious about supporting Canadians, the word homelessness, fight against poverty, investing in Canadians. I could give them some ideas, starting by voting in favour of programs that we're establishing to tackle poverty, rent, housing, and feeding children. I think that would be the very base. The Honourable Member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Prime Minister, this Liberal government, supported by the Bloc, has caused this crisis, and now they want to be applauded? Mr. Speaker, it's not only responsible, well, because of the $500 billion in inflationary spending that this Prime Minister established and the Bloc supported, which is affecting gas, housing, everything costs more. Mm-hmm. Many more Canadians are lining up at food banks. They're the one who created this crisis. Will the Prime Minister admit it's time to curb the centralizing government's appetite so that all Quebecers can finally eat well? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind people who are listening today and Canadians, if it was up to the Conservative government throughout the biggest pandemic we have experienced, people would have suffered enormously, Mr. Speaker. Today, we're in a better position because a Liberal government was there to support Canadians in their biggest crisis that we have ever seen. And today, what we're asking them is simple. Adopt reform on dental care, adopt reform on food measures and housing. But they're voting against all of this. The Honourable Minister for Trois-Rivières. Let's go back to the case of the member for Glengarry, Prescott Russell. To prevent his dismissal as president of the Association des Parlementaires de la Francophonie, or the APF, the Liberals infiltrated this organization. They signed up massive numbers to boost the number of Liberals from 25 to 112, including a whole bunch of unilingual Anglophones. For the first time, the APF had to send out an agenda in English. It even had to call in interpreters for the unilingual English-speaking Liberals, suddenly enamored with French. Did Liberals realize that to protect their colleague from the APF, they're literally anglicizing him? The Honourable Minister, Global Affairs. Canada will always be here to support Francophones internationally. In fact, Canada is the co-founders of the International Association of la Francophonie. I'd like to remind my colleague that is a parliamentary, an assembly, APF, and we are going to continue not only to support this assembly, but also become proud of the fact that it is a great Canadian, a Franco-Ontarian, who is chair of this assembly. So we are here to be French in Quebec and across the country and worldwide. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Correction. Just imagine, to protect a Liberal who denies the decline of French in Quebec and also responsible for the decline of the APF. But the responsibility doesn't end there. All these new French enthusiasts at the APF read the OQLF report yesterday. It ranks Quebec number 1 with the lowest proportion of workers using French most often. The federal public service. The Liberals are responsible for the Anglicization machine in Quebec workplaces. When will they stop fueling the decline of French? The Honourable Minister of Global Affairs. Mr. Speaker, we have absolutely no lessons to learn from the Bloc because we know their objective is still to show that only sovereignty in Quebec will work for Quebecers. But Quebecers aren't fooled. They know that they have a strong government, government that recognizes that there is a decline in French for the first time in Quebec and across the country, and we are able to reinvest in the improvement and protection of French to be here for Francophones across the country, so we have really no lessons to learn from them. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Oh, that makes me laugh. The federal government is Quebec's worst employer for French. Coincidentally, it's the main employer in the Gatineau region. Between 2016 and 2021, the proportion of Gatineau residents working primarily in French fell from 77% to 62%, a drop of 17% in only 4 years. We're talking about Gatineau, Hull-Elmer, Pontiac, La Petite Nation, 4 Liberal MPs. Their public service is the worst workplace in Quebec for French, and coincidentally, French is declining in Gatineau more than elsewhere. Instead of protecting their colleague at the APF, will they protect Francophones in Gatineau? The Honourable Minister,
right near Ottawa.
Government House
Leader.
Leader.
It is what it is.
Mr. Speaker, I am very proud of our Quebec participation in the government's federal public service. We grew Quebec's participation in the federal public service. We are very proud to have public service jobs, and we are also very proud of Quebecers' participation on the other side of the river. So yes, Mr. Speaker, we are a bilingual government that takes care of both official languages on both sides of the river.
The Honourable Member from Tobic-Mactaquac.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. We see it across the country with our own eyes, and it's now affirmed by Food Banks Canada's latest report. According to the report, nearly 50% of Canadians feel financially worse off compared to last year, and 1 in 4 people are going hungry. I've heard from several food banks that the fastest growing demographics they serve are working families and seniors. Mr. Speaker, the character of a nation is revealed in how it treats its most vulnerable, and Canada is failing them. When will this NDP Liberal government get off their backs, respond to their desperate pleas? How about starting now by axing the carbon tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I am glad to see that Conservatives are finally aligning themselves with Food Banks Canada. We saw over a decade of the Harper Conservatives. They did nothing to address food insecurity in Canada. Today, what our government is doing is we're creating more competition in the marketplace, and we're investing in a national school food program, both of which the Conservatives oppose. I don't know how the Conservatives can say they care about struggling Canadians when they oppose and would take food out of the mouths of children.
Shameful.
You're voting against your budget overall.
Mr. Speaker, what an incredibly all-encompassing and comprehensive non-answer that was from the member. Mr. Speaker, just a couple of months ago, I visited the food bank in Oromocto, New Brunswick. Oromocto is home to Base Gagetown, Canada's largest military base. We were shocked when we discovered from the director of the food bank there that they serve upwards of 50 service military members and their families. That's 1 out of every 10 clients they serve. Mr. Speaker, our brave men and women deserve better, and they are asking for this government to do the right thing. It's not more than what they can give right now. Why don't they start by axing the tax and getting off their backs?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I marvel at the temerity of a person who would stand in this House and vote against a pay raise, a well-earned pay raise for every member of the Canadian Armed Forces, and vote against that pay raise and then stand up and pretend that they actually care about the men and women who serve our forces.
The Honourable Member from Regina Leuven.
After 9
long years, this Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost. The numbers out from the Canada Foods Bank are damning. 50% of Saskatchewan people feel they're worse off this year than last year. 35% of Saskatchewanians are afraid they're not going to be able to feed themselves or their family. This NDP Liberal Cauchy Coalition can do the right thing right now and axe the tax so parents can put food on the table for their kids.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
What is clear, Mr. Speaker, is that that member and that party want to ruin the rebate for Canadians. What is also clear, we mentioned homelessness in this House today. Quite a shock, Mr. Speaker, and hypocritical.
Don't take our money and then give us some of it back. If you look at their housing plan, it never mentions homelessness. They don't want to do anything on these things. And if you want to understand the compassion of the party opposite and of their leader specifically, look a few months ago what the leader did. He went to someone's home, stood in front of it, and called it a shack. A member of the working class, Mr. Speaker, that's a respect they have for working people. They're not a serious party, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Liberals made the decision to expand the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which will result in 7 times more tanker traffic in Burrard Inlet. People in Port Moody, Coquitlam, and Morin-Belcarra are at risk of evacuation, fire, smoke, inhalation, and carcinogens in the event of a spill. The government of BC and the local health authorities are asking for a plan to protect people. Yet the Liberals have no plan, and the Conservatives have no concern to keep people safe. What are the Liberals going to do to protect Canadians in my riding and beyond from a catastrophic spill?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is, of course, incredibly important that as we move products to market, we do so in a safe and efficient manner. Certainly, the transport of oil by pipeline is far safer than the transport of oil by rail. It is important, though, that we put in place measures to assure British Columbians and Canadians that this will be done safely. Enormous time was spent on ensuring that we put in place those provisions with respect to the pipeline, but also with respect to marine shipping. Certainly, the Canadian Energy Regulator has played an important role in that. We will ensure that all of those safeguards are put into place and that the pipeline operates in a safe and efficient manner.
The Honourable Member from Timmins James Bay.
The poisoning of people in Grassy Narrows represents an unprecedented corporate crime. For over 60 years, the government has covered up and protected corporate criminality, and the result has been a never-ending nightmare for people suffering mercury poisoning that impacts everyone, including young children. We now learn that the Dryden Fibre Mill has been dumping sulfates into the Wabigoon River, which has been driving the mercury crisis for a new generation. So what steps will the Minister of Environment take to hold that company to a court, to account, and to work with the people of Grassy Narrows to finally clean up the disaster in the Wabigoon River?
Here, here.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
What's happening at Grassy Narrows is a tragedy, and all levels of government need to do better. Indigenous Services Canada is supporting several projects that will help meet the needs of the community without leaving home. Budget 2024 also provides an additional $57.5 million for the construction of the Mercury Care Home. This ongoing calamity tragedy at Grassy Narrows is a reminder of what happens if we don't protect our water sources from pollution. That's also why we introduced the First Nations Clean Water Act, to make sure First Nations have tools to protect their water sources and hold polluters accountable.
The Honourable Member from Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, in conversations, women, more than men, face being constantly interrupted. When women express their ideas, they often go unrecognized until reiterated by a man. When women push back, they're seen as less likable, and negative labels are disproportionately applied to them. It's critical now, more than ever, that men speak up to defend women's rights and underscore their support for lasting gender equality. Could the Minister of Justice reiterate our government's support on the importance of male allyship and ways our government is addressing this issue?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, I'm an ally and I'm speaking up. I'm speaking up about the epidemic of gender-based violence. I'm speaking up about women having full control over their bodies and their reproductive rights. That includes the right to abortion and the right to free contraception. When we as men make spaces for women's voices, we not only learn, we help create better, more inclusive policies. I urge every man in this chamber from every single party to stand up and to be that ally. The fight for gender equality in this country is a fight for all of us.
Here, here. The honourable member from Kelowna Lake Country.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. The government promised to end chronic homelessness in Canada by 2030. The Parliamentary Budget Officer found homelessness is getting worse, with chronic homelessness up 38%. The vast majority of homeless individuals in Canada, 80%, are homeless purely based on affordability reasons. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. How can this government spend so much with such failing results?
That's what you get at.
The Honourable
really
Minister for Families and Children.
Mr. Speaker, I have a really hard time listening to the Conservatives on that side of the House profess concern for Canadians who are struggling when we continue to see them vote against the measures that we put forward to support Canadians when they need us. Efforts to support and strengthen the social safety net, like $10 a day childcare, like moving forward with a national school food program, like moving forward with dental care to ensure they get the care that they need. We will continue to fight for Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, maybe that minister needs to fight for Canadians by actually listening to them and talking to them. Because after 9 years of that Liberal NDP Prime Minister, things have never been worse. Canadians are more hungry and they're homeless. The Parliamentary Budget Officer confirmed what most Canadians already know, which is homelessness has increased 38% despite them promising to end it. But wait, it gets worse. From the front page of the Toronto Star, City to prioritize larger homeless encampments in new strategy as number of tents cities grow citywide. When did the Prime Minister simply give up and say, you know what? A tent is good enough.
The Honourable Minister for Children, for Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've said it again. Once again, we hear the Conservatives stand in this House and profess their support for Canadians. But I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's not what we see day after day. When we put forward measures like the National School Food Program to ensure 400,000 more children have access to food at school, what do we see, Mr. Speaker? The Conservatives vote against. We put forward the Canada Child Benefit. What do we see, Mr. Speaker? They vote against. We will fight for...
The honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
After 9 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the hunger and the homelessness. This Prime Minister promised to end homelessness. The result of the posturing, long-term homelessness is up 38% because Canadians can't afford a place to live. More Liberal help like this will produce greater misery for Canadians. The NDP Liberal government doesn't understand that you can't spend your way out of a problem. When will the Liberals use common sense and realize that funding gatekeepers does not end homelessness?
Hear, hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
It is a tragedy, Mr. Speaker, any time a Canadian doesn't have a roof over their head. That's unacceptable, and it's incumbent on all of us to live up to the challenge, to work together to make sure this is addressed in a way that's not politicized, Mr. Speaker, but they're not capable of that, as we see. He talks about funding gatekeepers. What he's really talking about is working with, for example, not-for-profit organizations. There's an acquisition fund that we worked with not-for-profits to make possible, $1.5 billion. As a result, we will see that program move forward and units of housing kept affordable for everyday people. He's against it, as are they.
The honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Well, let's take a look at the record that they are so proud of. The results: homeless in Halifax have grown from 284 in 2015 to over 1,200 now. The housing minister gave taxpayer money to Halifax to hire 30 more gatekeeper bureaucrats. After 9 years, the NDP Liberal Prime Minister, there are now over 30 homelessness encampments in Halifax. Again, will the Liberals use common sense and realize that funding gatekeepers does not build homes?
Yeah.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I point him to the so-called housing plan of the Leader of the Opposition.
which says nothing about homelessness. So they can talk about this, but we know how serious they are. They're not serious at all. The gatekeepers that he talks about in this case are really municipal officials, mayors and councillors, for example, and others, who have seen in Halifax, in London, Ontario, in Brampton, across the country, 170 plus communities who understand that zoning changes are fundamental to getting more homes built. Missing middle housing, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, fourplexes, duplexes, triplexes, all of that is made possible, and they're against it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Today we're here debating federal encroachment on Quebec and provincial jurisdictions, and one striking example is the research chairs. The federal government is meddling in higher education and determining which fields of study our universities should put first if they want to get their share of the funding. Worse still, with their EDI criteria, Ottawa is deciding not only what subjects will be studied, but who teaches them. Ottawa is literally taking control over our universities. Why doesn't Ottawa let universities hire professors on their own based solely on merit? The Honourable Minister. That's so rich, Mr. Speaker. We thought the Bloc was going to pick a fight in other areas, but now it's even the universities. We invested $3.5 million in science all across the country in our last budget to help researchers and professors in our universities. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc should be delighted that we're investing in research and science. We know that people at home are delighted about that, and we will continue to invest in science in Canada. The Honourable Member for Drummond. People are delighted, but not by answers like that. Isabelle Haché gave the example of 2 computer science professor positions at UW, one open strictly to sexual and gender minorities, and the other only to racialized minorities. Forget about merit. It's like the case of a biology professor at Laval University 2 years ago. Who cares about qualifications? The university explained that they were simply complying with federal requirements. Ottawa has it wrong. You don't fight discrimination by discriminating. When are they going to put an end to these criteria that do more harm to universities than good for inclusion? The Honourable Minister of Innovation and Science. I want to make sure Quebecers watch. I bet you Quebecers are pulling their hair out. Imagine the Bloc is picking a fight over science. Imagine that. I think they're at the back of their playbook if they're finally deciding, oh, now it's time to pick a fight about funding for science. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to invest in our universities, in research and development, in science. We will help our young people because we know that today's science builds tomorrow's economy. We will continue investing in science, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Prime Minister, overspending and anti-farm policies are pushing more and more farmers into bankruptcy. According to the UPA, 1 in 5 farms can no longer afford to pay off their debt. With the help of the Bloc, the government is stifling our agricultural sector by blocking Bill C-234 and voting for more centralizing and inflationary spending. When will this government take our agricultural sector seriously and give it a break so it can feed our already starving population? The Honourable Minister and Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party knows full well that the price on pollution does not apply to Quebec, and he only needs to step forward 4 rows to speak to his leader if he wants to see Bill C-234 passed here in the House. It's the leader of the official opposition who determines the fate of that bill. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, what a typical response from the Liberal minister. They sit in their limos, out of touch with reality. Quebecers and Canadians are starving, thanks to this Prime Minister and the Bloc. Clearly, they're not worth the cost. In my region, food bank use is at an all-time high, 1 in 4 people. Over the past year, 10% of farms in the Chaudière-Appalaches region have gone under. When will this government finally get it and give our farmers the help they need? The The Honourable Minister of Tourism. Mr. Speaker, as you know, I'm also responsible for economic development in the regions of Quebec. And if there's one thing that can help all the regions, it's agriculture. We have supported the processing and the transformation of farms, the green transition, to make sure they contribute to net zero. Mr. Speaker, we are present in and operating in all areas of Quebec, and we will continue to be there to support this transition. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Prime Minister, more and more Quebecers are hungry and homeless. The inflation crisis hitting Canadians is the result of the centralizing and inflationary spending of this government, which is 100% Bloc-backed. The Bloc, which claims to defend the interests of Quebecers, voted in favour of $500 billion in budgetary appropriations, which are fueling inflation. So it's not just this Prime Minister who's not worth the cost, it's the Bloc too. Do the Bloc and the Liberals understand that the more money goes to Ottawa, the less money there is for Quebecers? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. I can say one thing that people watching at home will understand. They know that here on this side of the House, we're willing to invest in Canadians. People can see that the Conservatives' plan is to cut all programs. They have the nerve to stand up today, and those watching will see that all the Conservatives who've stood up today voted against the Canada Child Benefit. They voted against the dental program. They will vote against the school food program.
Yes, they will.
I don't know how they can even look at themselves in the mirror, but today we've seen the true colors of the Conservative Party.
Honourable Member from Charlottetown.
Mr. Speaker, my province of Prince Edward Island has saved more than $2 million in out-of-pocket costs since the launch of PEI's copay program last year. This federal funding for PEI has improved access to prescription drugs and made them more affordable for Islanders. The success of this pilot can be replicated across the country. Can the Minister of Health describe the impact that universal single-payer coverage for contraception and diabetes medication will have on the health of Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to start by commending the advocacy and work of the member for Charlottetown, who's been working tirelessly to make sure that Islanders get the coverage they need, saving them hundreds of dollars. And I can tell you that in the many times I've been out with him in Prince Edward Island over the last 10 months, that getting to talk to people what that means, not just for affordability, but for prevention, to make sure they don't wind up with a chronic disease or illness. And I'll tell you, the Conservatives say it's too much for people to hope that they can get the medicine that they need. They say it's too much to hope that somebody can get the dental care that we need. 100,000 people got dental care in just 3 weeks. We are getting it done, Mr. Speaker.
Calm down, man. Jeez. You're going to have a heart attack.
The Honourable Member from Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
At his billion-dollar green slush fund, the Prime Minister's hand-picked chair is being investigated for lining her own pockets and resigned in disgrace. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, this Prime Minister clearly isn't worth the cost for that corruption. But another NDP Liberal appointed director has been caught funneling $42 million to companies that she has stakes in. The Liberals knew it, but then they promoted her to the infrastructure bank anyway. But wait, she suddenly resigned. They gave her keys to a bigger mansion after burglaring the first one. Will they investigate every dollar she handed out?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation and Science.
Mr. Speaker, now you're seeing the Conservative Party of Canada going after any company, Mr. Speaker, that will work against climate change in this country. That's what these Conservatives are about, Mr. Speaker. Behind these questions, they're against new technology to help fight climate change. They know very well, and I've said it many times in this House, the moment we heard about delegation, we launched an investigation. The chair has resigned, the CEO has resigned. We are investigating. We're going to make sure that every dollar, Mr. Speaker, that is spent is going to be well spent. We're going to restore governance, we're going to restore confidence, and we're going to keep investing in Canadian companies, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Leeds-Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
It's really too late that we only see the minister get animated after they get caught. Speaker, the NDP Liberal-appointed chair and another director were caught stuffing their pockets full of taxpayer cash. They got caught. They resigned. They're being investigated. But then a third one, who was found to be furthering her own interests, was then appointed to the infrastructure bank, but suddenly resigned, much to the surprise of the minister responsible. This is life after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government. They have no idea where the money is going. We need to protect Canadian tax dollars. Will they call in the RCMP to investigate?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, that's the same question he just asked and that the minister just answered. But while we're here and have some time, Mr. Speaker, I want to know why there is a woman in Aurora named Sabrina Maddow and another one, and they're both women, by the way. Her name is Rachel Gilliland, alleging things that don't seem quite kosher in Conservative nomination land. And that is after the accusations by Ms. Maddow of illegality in a Conservative nomination, and they just happen to be the only two women in that nomination race. Why?
Order. I know that all honourable members, all ministers. Order. I know that all members and especially all ministers understand that, of course, that when questions are asked, it should be about the administration of the government or the committees. And it's the same thing which is expected of ministers to respond to the administration of government. The honourable member from Vancouver Quadra. Oh, excuse me, I've made a mistake. The honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton.
Speaker, after the Prime Minister got caught turning a blind eye to Beijing's interference in our elections, his government was dragged kicking and screaming into calling a public inquiry. It has now been revealed that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are obstructing the work of the inquiry by refusing to turn over documents to the Commissioner. A simple question: will the Prime Minister end the obstruction and turn over all documents requested by Madam Justice Hogue, unredacted, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister for Public Security.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend knows very well that there's no obstruction at all. He should have a word with his House Leader, with whom I worked very collaboratively all summer in setting up the Hogg Commission. We agreed to all the details of the terms of reference, including the fact that solicitor-client privilege and cabinet confidence were essential things that needed to be protected. And, of course, the people that served in Mr. Harper's government would know the attachment Mr. Harper had to those principles. But our government went a step further and made available cabinet documents that were relevant to this inquiry, and will continue to do everything necessary to allow them to do their work.
Hear, hear.
And now it is the turn of the member from Vancouver Quadra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government stands proudly on the side of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But if elected, the opposition, the official opposition, could become the first federal government to create laws that knowingly violate Canadians' rights. They would do this by invoking the notwithstanding clause, trampling on our charter. As a parliamentarian, but even more as a Canadian, I find this simply chilling. Will the Minister of Justice please elaborate on the importance of protecting Canadians' charter rights?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, the Charter protects your right to free expression. It protects your right to worship whom you choose. It protects your right to equality, and it protects your right to be presumed innocent. If you stand for freedom, you don't get to cherry pick which rights and freedoms you defend. But that's exactly what the Leader of the Opposition has said he would do. He has openly declared that he would use the notwithstanding clause to trample on these very charter rights. No federal leader has ever done this in Canadian history. Our government enacted the Charter, our government stands by the Charter, and we will always defend the charter rights and freedoms of every Canadian.
The Honourable Member from Skeena, Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, decades ago, the Liberals promised to stop the closure of rural post offices. But in classic Liberal fashion, they've broken that promise year after year after year. We've lost 500 rural post offices since 1994, 33 last year alone. And before the Conservatives start heckling, their record when they were in government was even worse. How many rural post offices are going to have to close before this minister finally does something?
Here, here.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member opposite because he speaks to a very relevant issue that's affecting Canada, all across Canada, not just in his community but everywhere. We're working closely with Canada Post to ensure that we change its ways so as we can improve delivery across the country. It's a serious issue. We recognize that. We're having deliberations over it. We're working closely with Canadians, and we're going to be spending more time to discuss how we can improve the operations of the organization to better serve Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, congratulations to the Liberal government. Congratulations on achieving the highest interest rates in 2 decades, on sustained high food prices not seen since the 80s, and reducing Canadian living standards to almost the lowest levels in 40 years. Mr. Speaker, spread out over 20 years and beyond the next election, Budget 2024 solves nothing. Yes, Mr. Speaker, Canada has come a long way since 2015. Unfortunately, it's in the wrong direction. Given a long list of failures, will the finance minister resign, take the entire cabinet with her, and go paint leadership posters for Mark Carney?
I love that question.
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, our government is focused on keeping inflation low so that interest rates can come down. We have a fiscally responsible plan, and we will continue to maintain strong economic indicators, a AAA credit rating, the lowest net debt to GDP ratio in the G7, all the while having supports for Canadians in Budget 2024, such as affordable housing, such as ECE and early childhood learning, such as supports for a national school food program. Mr. Speaker, we have a comprehensive plan and we're compassionate. Thank you.
And so we come to the end of question period. And I'm going to ask all members to take their conversations outside before we hear la déclaration hebdomadaire.
All right, guys, that's it for today.
It is now time for the weekly statement made by the member for Regina Capel.
And
but first,
yeah, check on the channel. I'm going to have
there's
some really good committees. There was already one good one that I posted with Landsman, but there's a couple more I'm going to post in a bit. So just check back on the channel and check those out. It'll be really good.